Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or just welcome from wherever and whenever you are listening to the latest Global in the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. As always, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, as well as your host for this timely and engaging podcast. Thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to listen, and for all the ways you have helped shape the global conversation. I'm looking forward to another fascinating discussion and hope it will inspire you to more deeply engage with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and its various programs. A big thank you to all our members and donors who make this work possible. Looking back on all that we have accomplished together, particularly in the past 15 years, I'm amazed by our shared success. I want to thank McLean Middleton for continuing their strong support for our global work. This important relationship continues to empower so much of what we do at the Council. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 115 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Now, on with the show.
The revolutionary victory takes place on January 1, 1959. Then there was a reasonable relationship during several months, but beginning in the fall of 1959, there is an acceleration of conflict.
The relationship between the United States of America and Cuba goes back a long way and remains filled with grievance and conflict. The story starts well before the Communist Revolution of 1959, but we'll start here as there's plenty to cover since then until today.
Call it escalation, call it anger on both sides, misunderstandings. Put it all together in a soup or in a stew, and by January of 1961, the United States breaks diplomatic relations with Cuba.
This is Jorge Dominguez, a former professor and expert on Latin America, with a focus on Cuba and Mexico. He was born in Havana, Cuba, but now lives here in New Hampshire.
During the course of 1960, the U.S. had begun to impose what was then called first a sugar embargo, then a broader trade embargo, and today, for practical purposes, is a blockade of the island. The Cuban government retaliated by expropriating all properties that belonged to U.S. citizens and U.S. companies. That question, compensation for those expropriated properties, is one of the contemporary issues in U.S.-Cuba relations. Perhaps the most compelling moment in U.S.-Cuban relations occurs in October of 1962, what came to be known in the U.S. as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union, with the consent of the Cuban government, placed intermediate-range ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads in various sites in Cuba. President Kennedy imposed a naval blockade, and the crisis was resolved when the Russian and U.S. governments agreed that these missiles and warheads would be withdrawn from Cuba, that the United States promised not to invade Cuba, and not publicly known at the time, but part of the substantive agreement, that the United States would withdraw similar missiles it had stationed in Turkey. So that was the world-threatening moment.
There's been a lot written about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I encourage anyone who hasn't done so already to dive deeply into this formative historical moment. It's quite possibly the closest we have come to a nuclear disaster, as a Soviet submarine almost launched a nuclear-tipped torpedo as they thought they were under attack by U.S. forces trying to impose a full blockade of Cuba. Check out Black Saturday, October 27, 1962, for a more in-depth look at just how close the world came.
U.S.-Cuban relations since then have had peaks and valleys. The part that the public knows best is that the two governments have gotten along very badly. And that's true. How badly ranges over time, certainly quite badly during the course of 2026. The part that the public may know less well is that there have been numerous agreements, diplomatic agreements, political agreements between the Cuban and the U.S. governments over the course of these many decades. Many of the agreements have dealt with migration. The first one, it was not called that way, but it was in effect the migration agreement, was under President Kennedy. The more substantial one was under President Johnson. There were additional migration agreements under President Reagan, under President Clinton, under President Obama, and ratified by President Trump. I mention the names of the presidents because it really is helpful to bear in mind there were many presidents who reached these agreements. They were from both political parties, a wide ideological range, and it included President Trump's ratification of the migration agreement reached between Cuba and the United States at the end of the Obama presidency.
This includes the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966, which allows for Cubans who arrived in the U.S. after the 1959 revolution to obtain permanent residency in the United States without having to apply from their home country first. It also includes freedom flights, the Mariel boat lift, an agreement in 1984 where Cuba accepted back immigrants with criminal records in exchange for 20,000 Cubans being allowed to immigrate to the U.S. each year, the wet foot, dry foot policy, and other agreements. However, the relationship runs deeper than just on managing immigration.
Other agreements that were reached that may be much less well known. Under the Nixon administration, the U.S. and Cuba reached an agreement that dealt specifically with the hijacking of airplanes. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was an epidemic of airplane hijackings, many of them over the skies of the United States, not just elsewhere in the world. Putting an end to that was really an issue of major public safety, and it was handled very successfully through an agreement. Beginning another category of agreements starts in the early 1990s. Now, these are mostly agreements that are sometimes called understandings, meaning you understand that I understand that you will behave in this way and not behave in that way, and vice versa. And so at the beginning of the 1990s, the U.S. government began to pick up migrants in the Caribbean, many of them from Haiti, and would send them to the U.S. naval base near Guantanamo Bay in eastern Cuba. And so it was important for the two governments to reach an agreement. The most basic agreement was to seal the border between the Guantanamo base and Cuban territory. Seal the border meant that two sides would make sure. The U.S. did not want those being held in Guantanamo to get out, and the Cuban government did not want those held in Guantanamo to get in. That agreement was even more important when the U.S. began to send to Guantanamo as a prison those who were accused of terrorist attacks, 9/11 and other instances, when in fact the U.S. did not want to get out and the Cubans did not want to get in. But there were other security-related agreements that were reached in this casual way during the course of the 1990s, and they affected mainly the U.S. Coast Guard on the U.S. side and the Cuban Coast Guard and Cuban Navy on the other side. Some of that was search and rescue. Some of that was particularly important, cooperation against drug traffickers. That is, information shared by the two sides, and whoever can capture or stop the drug trafficker coming through doing so. The two Coast Guards developed a really very sustained professional relationship. And by the end of the 1990s, the U.S. Coast Guard permanently deployed a senior Coast Guard officer to Havana, attached to the U.S. Embassy at the time called U.S. Interest Section in Havana, to facilitate this coordination. So the law enforcement cooperation between the two governments has been sustained. I want to emphasize that cooperation has continued during the second Trump administration. This is not only for the Coast Guard, but in instances of crime, Cuban government has invited, the U.S. has sent FBI officers to investigate crimes that involve the violation of law both in Cuba and the United States. So, yes, it's a very complex relationship. It has lots of conflict. It has created any number of troubles, but this underlying feature that from time to time on important topics, the two governments reach agreement has been part of that shared history as well.
Of course, one of the most well-known features of the relationship between these two countries is the embargo that the United States has maintained in various forms over the past 65 plus years. Here, too, the relationship has ebbed and flowed over the years, changing along with the nature and needs of the moment.
At the most basic level, the embargo was the United States would not purchase anything from Cuba, and the United States would not export anything to Cuba. That's the starting line of this game, if you will. At the beginning, the main item that was affected was sugar. Cuba used to be a major sugar producer and exporter, and it sent nearly all of that to the United States, and the United States relied on Cuban sugar. But it expanded much more broadly. Cuba stopped being a major sugar producer by the beginning of the 21st century. So sugar now plays a relatively modest role even in the Cuban economy. Cuban levels of sugar production today are about what they were a century ago. Cuba produces only a few 100,000 tons of sugar today. At the end of the 1980s, it produced over 8 million metric tons. So that's a very big change. Back to the trade embargo. So the beginning was U.S. retaliation for Cuban expropriation of U.S. properties. Also at the beginning, it was an attempt to bring about the fall of the Cuban government and the expectation that Cubans would rise up in arms and overthrow the Cuban government over this. Then, as the Cuban-Soviet relationship developed, it was intended to increase the cost to the Soviet Union of engaging with Cuba and supporting Cuba. It was related to a broad diplomatic attempt to isolate Cuba. That included collective sanctions that in the 1960s were imposed under U.S. leadership by the Organization of American States that involves the U.S. and Latin American countries at the time. By the time we reach the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses, at the Cold War in Europe comes to an end, the Russian Federation does not sustain the support that the Soviet Union had given Cuba. Cuba has a very severe economic crisis at the beginning of the 1990s, somewhat similar to the one today, worse in some respects, not in others.
There have been many challenges to an effective embargo, mainly that other countries only maintained their own sanctions against Cuba for about a decade. But one major consequence was to give the Cuban government a major pass on the lack of economic development. By simply pointing to all the ways the United States has put economic pressure on the island, the Castros were able to simply say, look, your economic situation is not our fault. Look to the boogeyman to the north. On the other hand, there have been efforts to relax parts of the economic tension by various presidents over the years.
By the end of the 1990s and the beginning of this century, there is a change in U.S. trade law, and there are a set of negotiations between the U.S. and Cuba, supported politically in the U.S. by senators who are Republicans and Democrats from the farm states, and mainly senators. And here the Republican senators of the farm states were very important. And so beginning in late 2001, George W. Bush is president, the U.S. begins to export significant amounts of agricultural products understood broadly, not just food, but machinery and equipment, poultry, and the like to Cuba. And it becomes the main international source of food for Cuba. These agricultural exports in the hundreds of $millions every year, again, let me emphasize, have continued under the Trump administration. Last year, 2025, for which, there's years completed, was the largest amount of money in that transaction. Amount of purchases varied every year, but for example, the value of U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba was larger during the first Trump administration than under the Obama administration. This is not an ideological or political issue. That changes the flavor of the embargo when the U.S., in fact, is a major exporter. Beginning more with the Biden administration, continuing under the second Trump administration, the U.S. has also been exporting tens of millions of dollars per year in pharmaceutical products and medical instruments and the like. Another significant break in the provisions of what had been the trade embargo. The U.S. has begun to authorize, this has not had much impact, but another breach in the trade embargo, the Cuban private sector to export to the United States. These tend to be relatively small quantities of money. And the U.S. has begun to authorize the export to the Cuban private sector as well.
Hearing about the Cuban private sector probably won't surprise many who have made it this far into the conversation, but it is an interesting point to talk about, as most people think of a totalitarian communist state, very much in the Soviet model where private ownership of anything is disallowed.
So in the 1960s, it was the real thing. Yes, there was a Communist Party. Yes, there was an alliance with the Soviet Union. There were no national elections. It was sort of the idea that the revolution inherently legitimated the Cuban government at the time. But it was a Cuban government that, of course, insisted in the monopoly of major economic activity, but it also owned and operated all the television stations, all the radio stations, all the newspapers. It had greatly limited the operations and the permissibility of religious activities in churches, synagogues, and other forms of religious expression. And at its most extreme, in the mid-1960s, it created coerced labor camps called the Military Units to Aid Production, UMAP is the acronym in Spanish, to which those who were not conforming with the approved forms of behavior from the Cuban government and the Communist Party were sent. This included Jehovah's Witnesses, it included some Roman Catholic priests, some Protestant ministers, but this entity, this organization, was best known because many homosexuals were sent there, and that was the word used at the time. Words akin to gay, lesbian would be used only later. They were being sent there in order to be re-educated, to change their behavior. These circumstances justify calling the political regime at the time totalitarian.
While many aspects of the revolution remain in place, the regime has changed significantly in many ways. Just because the cars most often seen on the streets of Havana are from the 1950s and 1980s does not mean the whole country is stuck in those time periods.
Take, for example, LGBTQ issues. Raul Castro's daughter, Mariela, has run a center, social political center in Havana, that has led the way, including the enactment of laws, the training of police officers, that being gay or lesbian or trans in Cuba is not a crime, that these are people who deserve respect and support. Cuba allows same-sex marriage. Cuba supports in its healthcare system, healthcare, a full range of healthcare procedures for transgender people and the like. So that's just an illustration of a very big change.
In addition, the control over the internet has been relaxed. Political criticism is more tolerated, and protests have become more commonplace.
The government has lost the monopoly of information. There is social media. There are street protests of some sort or another, usually banging pans and making noise, almost every day. Certainly every day somewhere in Cuba, but almost every day somewhere in the city of Havana. None of this had happened before. Cuban government officials, when they're now these protests, in some instances, of course, they arrest people and take them to jail, may release them in 48 hours, but do arrest them. But in other instances, you have the local Communist Party official who goes to talk to people and say, hey, let's sit down and have a discussion about this.
Finally, the Cuban government has begun to make some major changes to the way the economy works and how it engages with other countries around the world.
A couple of weeks ago, they enacted significant market-oriented economic reforms. Nothing like this had taken place since the 1960s. These greatly liberalize what private sector enterprises may do. They are designed to facilitate international trade and investment, including by the private sector, including by Cuban diaspora communities in the United States, in Europe, or in Latin American countries. They indicate that there will be an attempt at significant reforms on how state enterprises operate, the transformation of at least some state enterprises into companies where individuals and other companies may invest. Will this actually be implemented? I don't know. On paper, these are significant reforms. Economists, whom I know personally and have worked with in the past, worked on the framing of these new policies. But the implementation depends on officials in a government that up to now have resisted the adoption and implementation of reforms of this type. Have they been born again? Wait and see.
What happens next certainly remains to be seen, as the relationship between the United States and Cuba appears to be at one of the most volatile points in at least the recent history. There are no crystal balls here, but there are positive signs that Cuba is moving in the right direction, given the pressure being put on by the Trump administration.
The fact that reforms are taking place, I think, has to be credited in part to the Trump administration. And the fact that these reforms have been or are being adopted, and I hope implemented, in my personal view, now not just as an analyst, but in my personal view, is a good thing. It is also the case that there has been for a long time, I mentioned these economists whom I know and have worked with, a group of Cuban economists at the University of Havana at various research centers who have been advocating for the enactment of market-oriented reforms. In the long view from 1959 to 2026, the only period of sustained economic prosperity in Cuba was from the beginning of the 1970s to the middle of the 1980s, about a 15-year period. And that was when the economy adopted more market-oriented reforms than it ever had or than it ever would in the years that followed. So many of these economists kept highlighting that period, said, when we did this, it worked. The economy could and did grow. So there had been domestic reasons, economic arguments, political discussions, saying it's a good thing. But it had not happened until the Trump administration policies made the Cuban leadership squeal.
Some of the things that the U.S. has done to tighten the screws on the government include the seizing of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, cutting off a key access point to cheap oil, implementing third-party sanctions on anyone trying to sell oil to Cuba, ending oil sales from Mexico and even Russia, and indicting and sanctioning top Cuban officials in an effort to bring so much pressure to bear that the regime breaks. All of this has brought Cuba to a breaking point where they are running out of diesel as well as food.
When no petroleum is coming in and you depend significantly on petroleum imports, it means your electric system can't not function. So Cubans whom I know and I deal with in some sense every day by chat groups and WhatsApp and other means are averaging 3 to 4 hours of electricity per day in the city of Havana, less as you go toward eastern Cuba. This is a catastrophe. Think of stuff in your refrigerator. Think about when it is are you going to cook something. Think when it is for people who have small children, how they're going to have enough light to be able to read and study. If you send school kids home because you want to save on electricity in schools, because the teachers cannot drive to work because there's no gasoline, because the teachers cannot get on buses because there's no gasoline, when are they going to do this? Moreover, the internet requires electricity. Your kids are not going to learn. You have surgery scheduled because it turns out your gallbladder is telling you you're about to die. Well, it can't be done because there's no electricity. This is, on any number of levels, a catastrophe. And when on top of that, you had these continuing Cuban government policies that had prevented the Cuban private sector from producing more food, from trying to connect to Cuban Americans in the United States for investment capital and the like, it really was a catastrophe on both sides.
With the recent passage of 176 changes to the legal structure for the Cuban economy, many are saying this puts Cuba on the path to implementing the largest changes to how the economy is structured since the revolution. Opening spaces for private business, foreign investment, the free hiring of personnel, and even permitting the opening of fast food chains has been moved forward in an effort to pressure the United States to lift its financial and energy sanctions on the country. At the same time, they continue to message that this is a local reform based on lessons learned from other communist countries with market economies, such as China and Vietnam. The successful implementation of these reforms relies on the Cuban government to actually enforce them, but also to have the United States lift the restrictions on doing business with the country, including the secondary sanctions on third-party countries.
What the Cuban government has now been doing is to say, okay, we will not contribute further to the disaster that has befallen the people of Cuba. The question is whether on the Trump administration side, whether the president, or the Secretary of State, who is the main architect of this policy, whether they will choose to declare victory. They could. They have not. And for the most part, the official line out of the Department of State in particular has been to dismiss these reforms that have been enacted by the Cuban government, saying the Cuban government has to do more. The more would refer principally to political changes. The political structure has, in its formal arrangements, not changed much. Informally, Cuban political system has changed.
The Trump administration has indicated that they remain committed to maximum pressure and has not ruled out a military intervention, with President Trump speaking openly about an invasion once the military is freed from the war with Iran. However, by not budging despite these reforms, the United States risks falling into the same trap as before, providing the Cuban government the excuse that they have tried reforms, that they want to make life better for everyday Cubans, but the United States won't allow it.
One effect of Trump administration policies has been to induce the reforms, but another effect has been to enhance the credibility of the Cuban government and Communist Party when they say the fault, look to Washington, look to President Trump. And it has given a bit of a pass to the Cuban government that once you enact some economic reforms, and once the Trump administration continues on the path as if nothing had happened, Cuban government is getting a little breather. How much, how long would it last? I don't know.
As the U.S. continues to push for major political reforms, it seems odd that this is the major sticking point. As the U.S. maintains relationships with many countries around the world run by single-party systems, as well as outright dictatorships. This, of course, is not new in U.S. foreign policy, but certainly can cause messaging issues, particularly in global forums. It also raises the question on whether anything short of complete regime change in Cuba would inspire the U.S. to ease off.
I could imagine that the Cuban government tomorrow would say, the argument that there ought to be inter-candidate competition, albeit within a single-party system, is okay. We'll do it tomorrow. And I could see Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying, and you think that's enough? Of course not. You could imagine the Cuban government making other within regime small changes of this type. At present, for example, if you or I were Cuban citizens and wanted to run for public office, we cannot. Candidates have to be nominated through official mechanisms. So another reform, perhaps even more important, would be to say we would allow people to collect petitions. You need 100 signatures, whatever it is. And if you do that, you then can run for office. That would be a little more significant. But again, all of this could be reacted to in Washington by saying it's not enough.
However, the question needs to be asked if regime change in Cuba is even in the U.S. interest, despite the long-standing policies of this country. We've seen examples throughout history, for many reasons, that new governments do not always turn out the way the United States hopes.
There has long been a scenario in U.S. government think tanks that says, would regime change in Cuba serve U.S. interests best? And one version of that is that the answer is no, because no other Cuban political regime will be as tough on its domestic criminals as this one has been. No foreseeable Cuban political regime will be as effective at blocking drug traffickers as this one has been. This is something U.S. Drug Administration websites have indicated. Of U.S. southern neighbors, no one is as effective as Cuba blocking drug traffic. Would a continuation of U.S. economic pressures, one of its effects is migration. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans that are in the United States without documentation. That presumably is not something that the Trump administration wants, but it is a perfectly predictable consequence of its policies.
So, as we look ahead, it seems that two extreme paths are on the table, with not much in the way of middle ground. One scenario sees the United States initiate a military intervention that looks to overthrow the Cuban government and, as President Trump has suggested, install Secretary Rubio as president. On the other side of things, the economic relationships win out as the U.S. continues to expand trade and investment, including from some major allies of President Trump.
You could imagine a scenario that has the 82nd Airborne landing in Cuba, and another scenario where Jared Kushner is a partner of the Cuban tourism ministry at a minimum. That's where the crystal ball doesn't work. But the fact that there is already hard evidence that either path could take place adds to the difficulty and to the complexity of thinking about the time ahead. One thing that has continued, which I think is important, is I'll call it the military to military relationship. It has been curtailed for obvious reasons during the last few months, but around the U.S. base in Guantanamo, that relationship at the border is sustained. The law enforcement relationship with the U.S. Coast Guard, with the FBI, has been sustained. For the longest time, in particularly the first Trump administration, the U.S. government bureaucracies least in favor of pressure in Cuba were the uniformed services.
Regardless of how all this turns out, one thing has come into focus throughout the long-standing conflict between these two countries. While the Cuban regime does have significant failings, it remains surprisingly resilient and effective in the diplomatic space.
In the middle of all of this, with a Cuban government that bears significant responsibility for the hardship of its people, so in no way do I want to just put the blame on current U.S. policy. Quite the contrary, this really is a Cuban government that failed its people by not making changes sooner. But it remains, in some respects, amazingly effective. The United Nations General Assembly just voted on a Cuban motion to condemn U.S. policies toward Cuba. And the U.S. managed to get a one-digit number of supporters. Cuba got over 130 countries to support it. There was about 30 abstentions. The abstentions were U.S., NATO partners, Canada, the Europeans, and the like, for the most part. But wow, that is an enormous verdict on what others elsewhere in the world think about U.S. policy, and a tribute to the efficacy of Cuban diplomats. This requires a lot of work to try to get governments, even governments that are politically close to the Trump administration. I'll just mention two, El Salvador and Honduras. President Trump went out of his way to support the relatively new president of Honduras. President Trump has showered praise on the president of El Salvador. Those two governments absented themselves from the General Assembly in order not to cast a vote. Wow! The efficacy of Cuban diplomats is amazing.
Whether this can save the regime in the long term remains to be seen. This is certainly an issue that will not resolve itself overnight, even if a decisive strike by the United States occurs. While the conditions in the country and the broader region seem ripe for a major intervention, geopolitical headwinds will continue to shape this regional issue. One can see positive pathways forward to resolving the long-standing relationship, but only by raising awareness about the realities of the situation can we move towards a positive resolution. Thank you so much for your time and attention. This has been The Global in the Granite State, a production of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Please like and subscribe to ensure you stay up to date on our latest episodes. Visit wacnh.org to join our mailing list and get more deeply involved in all the global conversations we host. Your engagement drives us forward. As always, Tim Horgan is the host, director, producer, audio engineer, researcher, scriptwriter, fact-checker, and mastermind behind all of this. Our theme music remains Admin by A. Alto, and our interlude music is Carnival by Alec Koff. Join us next month.